Hello, Nisha Toomey here. Happy to be able to virtually share my paper at the CIES this year, 2020. My paper is titled Effective or Not, Building Discussions on Dilemmas and Refusals into Research Practices, Perspectives from Participants. So for this presentation, I'm going to be switching from myself speaking on camera here to a PowerPoint presentation. I'll be going back and forth a little bit. Um, and yeah, I'll just get started. My PhD research maps how settler colonialism and white supremacy have shaped humanitarian activities and organizations through history and to the present, forming what I call the humanitarian imaginary. Specifically, in the context of the global land rush, the phenomenon of multinational corporations and overseas financial firms and speculators buying up land in the global south and often forcing or coercing local communities off their lands to do so, I am asking why the multi-billion-dollar industry of humanitarian aid and international development do not more overtly tackle issues of land confiscation, despite displacement via land loss often being the reason people require relief and aid services. I'm building on mounting critiques that the international aid industry does not tackle structural problems caused by capitalism. And I'm learning from indigenous theorizations of land and place. My dissertation explores what the humanitarian and aid sectors can learn from the theories and practices of communities that have been critical of development on their lands. I worked with some of these communities for a few years on the Thailand-Myanmar border, a region that is home to hundreds of thousands of refugees and displaced people, as well as some of the longest land sovereignty movements on Earth. Numerous international non-governmental organizations and community-based organizations have been anchored in this area for decades, and I had worked with both as an educator and project manager there. So because so much of my theorization is grounded in years of work in that particular place, after encouragement from friends and former colleagues, I realized that I should go back to that place to conduct my field research with the very people that I'd learned so much from. However, during my time living and working on the border, I had experienced academic and INGO-hired researchers who sometimes acted in really extractive ways toward local communities. So I approached the idea of doing research there with a lot of trepidation. Far too many academics assume that their research will bring good to local populations, and they think of themselves as de facto qualified to conduct research. A number of scholars have discussed this. Mohawk scholar Audra Simpson's path-breaking work on ethnographic refusal critiques the way that academic researchers have historically acted as, or imagined themselves to be, the voice of those they are researching. Simpson argues that research has been a technology of knowing used to uphold empire, and introduces the idea of refusal to provide both researchers and communities with a way to contend with knowledge building in the academy, to question the legitimacy of that knowledge, and to resist the epistemological violence academia can inflict when it essentializes, objectifies, and categorizes research subjects. Simpson builds questions into her ethnographic work that allow for both researcher and the researched to refuse to ask or answer certain questions and to decide together what knowledge gets shared. And I'm doing a lot of this in the data that I'll soon be processing and publishing about. Researchers often act with a flawed theory of change, what Eve Tuck calls damage-centered practices, documenting harms without being grounded in movements working for structural change, as if just writing about harm and violence would itself bring about some sort of change. Tuck and Yang explore the impact and perpetration of settler colonial logics in the academy, advocating a practice of refusal in social science research. They argue that the academy has used a flawed theory of change, one which believes that showcasing damage will prove to outsiders that reparations are deserved. Thus, the work of the academy is the reproduction of pain stories in its own voice, and, quote, much of what counts as voice and what makes voice count is pain. Tuck and Yang argue that settler colonial logics infuse this work and that these theories of change do not lead to authentic changes that are actually needed. They identify a teleological trajectory of pain in settler colonial logics. So, first, people are imagined as being unbroken, some pure and mythical, perfect way they were before, to broken in the depictions that are produced about, not by them, and then finally to unbroken again after the supposed intervention that will happen once this kind of research is published. These pain narratives cause a double erasure. The pain is to be erased, and the community's presumed damage are to be replaced by new and hopeful stories. Tuck and Yang argue that one of the greatest forms of harm done with this type of research is the appropriation of community stories. These arguments are reflected in research done by and for INGOs and humanitarian scholars, who have not adequately included the perspectives of beneficiaries in their work. These forms of research are often grounded in settler colonial logics which erase or exclude Indigenous, Black, and racialized peoples' worldviews, despite the fact that they are the stakeholders on whose behalf the research is being done. Rather than assuming that our research will bring change, scholars should assume that local communities already have their own forms of research and are already using them for their own benefits. We must openly and publicly confront the dilemma that our research may not be an effective way to make change. As an ethical practice, scholars working with marginalized communities in places affected by conflict and violence should always build existential questions of why they are conducting research into their methods and include participants in these discussions. Research practices should embed methods that encourage critique and exploration of academics in institutions' effectiveness in creating social change, and scholars should explore alongside their stakeholders not only what they are researching, but why they're doing research in the first place. Outsider scholars, in particular those from the global north researching the global south, need to especially feel confronted by a conundrum of purpose and intent and should engage these questions within their research design. I conducted half-hour, semi-structured interviews with 19 employees of CBOs, community-based organizations, and 13 employees of INGOs. 17 of my participants originated from Myanmar or Thailand, while the rest were foreigners. All had worked in the region for over 10 years, or almost all, and they were doing a range of work in health, education, and political activism. After questions addressing my main research topic, I ended with a general question about research, asking for participants' thoughts about the effectiveness of academic research and what I could do specifically to make my research useful to them. So this question was often greeted with looks of dismay or secretive grins. I encouraged participants to be candid with expressing how they feel, and they were. Participants discussed their experiences with academic research, offering examples of their own organization's research, and deliberated the difference between CBO and grassroots research and INGO research and academic research. I asked participants to suggest ways that my research could be directly useful to them, with the intent to fulfill any requests that I could. Their suggestions offer guidelines for how to move away from damage-centered research practices and toward research practices that might more effectively benefit communities. In this small way, I refuse the notion that my research is useful, and I invited participants to do the same. I refuse to assume that my research will bring change to the context I was working on, but I do imagine that opening the conversation to a critique of the research itself might offer some new possibilities and outlets for participants to discuss how change can be effected. I also made sure to read up on and be sensitive to issues around ethics and the language of consent, learning from Myanmar scholar Rose Metro. Overall, there was general doubt and cynicism about the positive impact of academic work on communities. Participants noted that paying to read journals was a major problem, limiting the access communities would have to research projects they participated in. They also felt that research was sometimes irrelevant by the time publications came out, and they discussed the, quote, ivory tower and conference loop, in which academics only relay their information back to one another. They noted the pollution caused by academics who fly in from foreign countries for short consultancies that local professionals are just as capable of doing. Academics were critiqued, particularly by those working with CBOs, for being divorced from the reality of the context they visited or for acting in parasitic ways towards communities. Participants argued that such researchers would, quote, never really get to the heart of the issue, and they noted that academic institutions do not provide enough support for scholars to publish versions of their research that would be accessible to the general public. A third of participants discussed that academic writing is much too often inaccessible to communities. And they gave tangible suggestions for how to make writing more accessible. The next most common response from participants was to make sure that the work academics do has a direct impact on communities by using research to design and influence future work planned by communities. Next, they talked about how scholars need to prioritize collaboration with communities. And this meant being very sure that they were involving community groups in co authorship and giving input on ethics processes. A large number of participants mentioned trust as an important element in making research useful and noted that trust needs to be built after years of work and forming solid relationships with people in the field. The vast majority of interviewees who were members of CBOs noted that they do research already as a part of their work. Some were part of organizations that do research as a core part of their mission, while others built research into their practices as a reflexive way to inform their future work. So, citing and using the research of those on the ground is a major way to collaborate with communities. Finally, universities need to provide more support for researchers to be able to work with communities in these ways, particularly in terms of helping academics publish legible materials for publics and participants. On the question of how my research could be more useful, participants offered concrete steps, including knowing the audience of the research before planning, involving as many community members as possible, making sure to get a good translator, having consent forms that are easy to read and very clear, relating the research with other communities across the world by looking at places dealing with similar issues, sharing the results back with communities, and using the research as an advocacy tool. So to finish off, I just want to say that these results are very initial still, and I'm presenting them anonymously here. However, I did not conduct this research with anonymity. Most of my participants will have their names published should they wish. I will be giving all of them the chance to read through any direct quotes that I give to them, as well as the portions that I'm writing about them. So I'll be giving them the chance to actually read it and provide me with feedback or change what they said in order to, in some ways, have them be as participant as possible in the research. Thanks so much for listening, and I hope that you'll send me an email or add some comments or questions on any portion of this talk. Thanks.